This URL is where you can find these slides. They're all online, mostly because I'm paranoid and I want to have them as a backup, but also you can refer back to them later. Some of the things that we'll see in here are like hot links, so they'll take you places. I'm just going to talk real quick about reactive forms in Angular. Note that I said Angular, not AngularJS, because it's the newest 2+ version of Angular. 6 just came out the other day. I haven't had a chance to check it out yet, but reactive forms have been around since 2 and are actually a really powerful part of Angular. It is, in some cases, the reason why companies or people choose to Angular in the first place is because they have a lot of forms, and reactive forms makes it much, much simpler. So you might be asking yourself, what is a reactive form? Well, first we have to talk about what is a template-driven form, which is something that is more traditional, because that will help us compare and contrast the two. So first I'll talk about a template-driven form, which is kind of like Peter Parker. I've got kind of a Spider-Man thing going on here. It's fine. It's, you know, nothing special. Template-driven forms are things that you've seen before, and specifically in Angular, they would look something like this. You've got a forms module that you import, and you put that into the imports like right under the declarations for your ng module. So here, the app module, that's the most like default name or whatever. Pretty straightforward import there. The HTML comes first. What I mean is, like, not literally you write the HTML first, but that's the way that we think of a template-driven form. So we sort of model it out this way and then go backwards. So a lot of times we'll maybe make a wireframe or a mock-up, and we think of it as a visual thing first and data second, which is going to be the opposite in reactive forms. Spoiler alert. So the HTML comes first as far as your mindset, right? So you've got a form. It's like an order form with a first name field, you know, pretty straightforward. Then you take that input and you bind it. You data bind it to a model. You say this input goes with this property, this data property, and you link the two together. Template-driven forms in Angular are asynchronous, which may or may not be a good thing depending on what you're trying to do. But specifically, if you're trying to unit test, asynchronicity can be a real pain in the rear. So that's where reactive forms can help us later. But to demonstrate the asynchronicity of this particular form in Angular, we see that this guy has this hashtag order form, and we can grab onto that with a viewChild decorator. So that allows us to reach into the HTML and get a hold of the entire form. And we can sort of observe the lifecycle events of what Angular's doing in this component by attaching these, you know, just writing these little functions, ng after view init and ng after content checked. And then we put a little, you know, console log or something, and we spit out this.orderForm.controls. So again, order form is the form itself, right? If we run this, we see that the form controls aren't actually there. You have to wait a tick to get those the form control to populate. It's actually in the second time the ng after content check occurs. So that, again, can make it kind of difficult to unit test whatever is happening in this form. Template-driven forms traditionally rely on events, and this is something that you've probably just seen a lot of in more traditional forms. So you've got, for example, a blur event, and then that blur event goes to this validate first name function, and you check a bunch of things, and maybe if you're lucky, there's no first name error, but if you're not so lucky, the error ends up being something like this, which is then turned around and bound using string interpolation to this error here, this class error, and we just spit it out. That's a pretty common kind of scenario with template-driven forms. There's nothing wrong with this. You can actually continue to use events if you want to with reactive forms, but I think that you'll see that there's less of a need, which makes it kind of appealing. So that's all template-driven forms, which is kind of, again, what we're all used to. Reactive forms takes a lot of this and turns it on its head. Nothing too special here. In your app component, or I'm sorry, your app module, instead of the forms module, you will import reactive forms module. Pretty easy. You can actually import both. So let's say you've got a really large application and it's got 100 forms and you want to take 5 of those forms and switch them over to be reactive forms. You can import both forms module and reactive forms module here and then use them appropriately. When you have a form though, it either has to be a template-driven form or a reactive form. You can't mix the two within a single form, if that makes sense. You can mix the concepts inside your entire module. As I discussed earlier, with template-driven forms, the HTML comes first, meaning we think about it visually and then we think about the data. With reactive forms, we think about the data first, and the visual part is almost secondary. So in the class here, we've got a customer class. It's got a first name property. I'm using Typescript, so I can specify that this first name is a string, and by default, it's empty. It's an empty string. And in my control, I would have an ng-on-init call to this create form function. It can be called whatever you want, but that's kind of a convention that seems to be out there. So you've got a create form function, and it declares this.orderForm to be this.formBuilder.group. Now, we'll talk about form builder in a minute, but for now, just know that it's like a convenient, it's a convenience tool for building reactive forms. So you can say, okay, form builder, make me a group, and inside of that group, I'm going to give you a customer model, and all of the properties of the customer model then get bound to the form magically. So you can imagine that if this customer class is huge and you have a lot of things to do in your form, it makes that really, really easy because maybe there are 100 properties, you just pass in the customer and it's like, bam, they're all there. Your form knows about them. It is bound, a specific input, for example, is bound to form controls. So what we actually do here, instead of specifying the data property that is being bound to, we specify the name. So here it's called first name because in our customer model, it was called first name. Does that make sense? So in that way, this goes right down to the property that we care about. This is also different. Form group has to be specified here. And this is just like something I do when I'm building a form so that I can make sure the data's, getting in there correctly. I just spit it out, and this is called a JSON pipe, where we can just, otherwise it would show up as like object with some hard brackets, and it's like, no, go ahead and expand that out because I want to see what that data looks like. So that makes it a little bit cleaner, but one of the really awesome things about reactive forms is that you're dealing with synchronous process rather than async. So we have essentially the same test that we did before. We've got this order form here, and we don't have to use a viewChild decorator. If I use this form group type here, it knows what this is, which is great. And we've got the same after view init and after view checked methods. And when we run this, again, these methods were the same as before. We can see that right after view init, those form controls are available for us to use, which is really, really handy. As the name implies, Reactive Forms uses reactive JavaScript libraries, which is generally known as RXUS. I have only been doing reactive JavaScript for a little less than a year, and it's kind of a lot to wrap your mind around. So if you're new to this library or really just this concept, I've included a couple of links here. There are two. LearnRxJS.io is really good, and then this is like an article that helps you get into that conceptual mode of reactive programming. These are called marble diagrams if you haven't seen one before, but it talks about how to take the data and manipulate it in some kind of like uniform fashion. So this is what goes hand in hand with reactive forms, because essentially you can listen for the data to change, and because you're listening to like the form control or whatever, you're not, it's actually the value inside of the form control. You don't have to put events on the fields like you would normally. You don't have to say, when someone blurs off of this field, go do something. You can just say, hey, whenever this value changes, I want to know about it. You don't care how it changes. You're listening to the thing that you really care about. There are three concepts, like there are three classes really that all inherit from abstract control. You've got form control, form group, and form array. Form control is a very simple thing that you would interact with, like a text input, a checkbox, you know, a toggle switch, things like that. A form group is a group of those things, as the name suggests. Things like address, product details, options. These are groupings, just conceptual groupings of controls that belong together, right? Address is the most common one because a street doesn't mean anything, but you also need the city and the zip code, right? Form array is a little bit less used, but it's for potentially infinite number of things. So think about things like pizza toppings, addresses, emergency contacts, right? These are things that you might want to dynamically create. When somebody hits the plus button, you want to dynamically remove them. When they hit minus, maybe you want to limit them or, you know, reorder them or something like that. So that's where a form array comes in handy. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, why should I care? Well, like I mentioned, synchronous forms are easier to test. Forms and models are more closely aligned, meaning that it's actually more work to call them different things. Like if it's a first name property in your class, that's what you're going to bind to in your form through that form control name property. So, or I guess it would be an attribute. So it's harder to screw it up, is what I'm getting at. Form controls can be grouped together. This is super powerful, not just for things like addresses, but for validation. There is very powerful validation that you get when you use reactive forms because of this grouping. So think about, for example, you've got two dates, right? And you want to make sure that the to date is chronologically before the after date. To and from. Like, let's say anytime you've tried to book a flight, right, a round trip flight, you're going to fly out on this day, you're going to fly back on this other day. Like, that's a group because you need to validate them together. You can validate them separately, but then you also need group level validation. And you can get many levels deep with this, which is really, really helpful. A little bit more on this validation. This is the abstract control base class. And you can see just in the declaration of the constructor here that there's a validator, which implicitly is a synchronous validator, and then also an async validator. So think about things like, you know, you shouldn't be allowed to enter a letter into this field. Well, that's a synchronous validation. We know that right away. But an async validation might be where you need to go talk to a server. So somebody enters in an email address or something, and then you want to go talk to some service and say, does this email exist? And then maybe 2 seconds later, it comes back to you. So that's why they're broken into categories like that. By default, with reactive forms, you get all of these validations right out of the box. You never have to write a validation for minimum number or maximum length ever again because they've got that covered. A very, very powerful one is this right here, validators.pattern, where you can pass in a regular expression and you can do whatever you want. It's really cool. Okay, so back to this model. Remember, we've got the green form controls, the blue form group, and the orange form array. Well, now you can start to think about forms like trees, right? Because you've got an order form up here. That's kind of like the parent group. And then under that, you've got 4 controls. Oh, sorry. That should be first name, last name, age, and send newsletter, okay? Send newsletter is a checkbox, so it's the thing that doesn't belong out of this group. So they're all grouped together under order form, and that's really simple. But now imagine that it gets a little bit harder, right? So now we want to group things under customer because first name, last name, and age all relate to the customer, whereas send newsletter is actually a marketing preference or whatever. So we're going to call that group something else. And then you can get deeper and deeper, right? So now we've got all the same things as before, and we've got this addresses array, and there's a shipping address, and there's a billing address. And each of those has form controls underneath it. So that can get really, really helpful because maybe you want to check something over here and say, oh, they've got something that needs to be shipped. It's a product that is physical. It's a physical product. Well, now I need to go and make sure that the shipping address is populated, right? Versus if they don't, you don't care. Okay, so in the synopsis, I said we would be building a form. I did this talk once before, and I was like, oh yeah, there's no way we're going to have time for that. So I put all the code online. You guys can go check it out if you want. And I'll just show you real quick what it is. My brother actually composes music, and he sells sheet music online. So I have this order form, and the link will take you to the source for this. It's written in Angular 5, and it uses Angular material, which makes everything kind of nicely animated, and then I can enter some things. This is a product form array, so I can choose the different products. And it's actually still in progress, so I just need to add some images and make it look really cool. But if I click on first name and then I exit off of that, it says, first name is required because I used validators.required. And so it's smart enough to like not freak out at first, but when the user interacts with the form and leaves it blank, it tells them that there's a validation problem. So anyway, you guys can check that out later. Not to mention, I'm not so good at live coding, so when I tried to fumble through that before, it wasn't good anyway. But that way, you can go through it yourself. Sorry, I'm trying to get my mouse out of the way. And that's pretty much it for me. These are all live links, like I mentioned, so this will take you to Longplay Software's site, and more information about me can be found there. And again, the slides can be found with that URL at the bottom. Thank you.